Good evening. Welcome to everyone here and those joining us on live stream. My name is James Ritza. I'm the Director of Adult Faith Development here for Thomas More Catholic Community. Tonight's talk is part of a three-part series discussing the relationship between faith and the body. So please join us again on June 1st when Dr. John Rose from the Keenan Institute of Ethics at Duke University will be speaking on the mystical body of Christ. Our distinguished speaker tonight is the Provost and Chief Academic Officer for the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's a distinguished professor of physics and astronomy, and we're grateful to have him also as a parishioner here. Tonight, he will be speaking on faith, science, and sacramental worship. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Christopher Clemens.
Thank you for having me here. I'm hoping for no protests tonight, so please, if you don't like something, you may leave quietly. I'm going to leave a lot of time for conversation. I want this to be a conversation, so I'll try to be uncharacteristically brief tonight. I want to talk first about a young man in 1619, 23 years of age. He called himself Poitevin, or Poitevin, as I would say in English. He had studied at Jesuit school, and he had joined the Catholic army of Maximilian I. He attended the coronation of Ferdinand II as Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and on his way from the coronation back to the army, he was caught in Ulm, near Munich, by winter. And on the night of November 10th, 1619, he had three dreams. In the first dream, he's walking and he's been afflicted on one side. So he's struggling and there's a wind that's impeding his progress. And he sees a college and seeks refuge there. And a man is there. He thinks he knows them. He feels he passed them without acknowledging him. And the man says, "I have something to give you for a friend." And he asks what it is. And he doesn't get an answer, and he wakes up disturbed in mind and spirit. He manages to fall back to sleep, and he has a second dream, which is just a thunderclap, a sharp noise that wakes him up, and he sees sparks, and they illuminate the room, and he feels they're coming from his eyes, that somehow he's seeing without light, that the light is emanating from his eyes. But he convinces himself a coal has fallen from the fire or a spark was still there, and manages to go back to sleep again. And in the third dream, it's calm. He sees on a table a dictionary and a poetry anthology. He opens the poetry anthology and he reads Quod vitae sectabor iter in Latin, which is "What path shall I take in life?" A man appears and presents another poem, Est and Non, what is and is not. He tries to find it in the book of poems. He says, "I think it's here," but he finds pages blank and missing, and the man and the books disappear. These are the dreams of René Descartes, the Catholic philosopher and scientist and founder of really algebraic analytic geometry. So he's disturbed and he's sure that God is telling him something. The questions are profound. They're about his life and the existence of things. And so he does what you or I or any other Catholic would do. He prays. And he puts his life under the protection of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and he commits to a pilgrimage from Venice to Notre Dame de Lorette. I tried to find out why that particular pilgrimage. It must mean something, but I failed. Not everything can be found on the internet, and the library was not accessible. He was, of course, one of the most famous philosophers, but one Catholics don't always claim, because he began to depart from the Aristotelian interpretation of Catholic theology and science and move toward a more modern approach. And that departs from some of the theology that's embedded in the thought of Aristotle. But I think we should claim René Descartes. He was Catholic, and we should keep these questions, especially if you're young. If you're 23 years old today, these are the questions. I live and work on a college campus, and I think there's a cultural moment like the one Descartes lived in, 1619. A new world has been discovered. It's 100 years in. Europe is in turmoil. The 30 Years' War is starting. Protestantism and Catholicism are at odds, and everything is being questioned because there are books being printed in large numbers. Ideas one could not see or have are being disseminated through a new technology with the printing press. And we've come to a new set of questions, a crossroads, if you like, not just in the intellectual life of the 23-year-old René Descartes, but in the intellectual life of the West, of the world. And I think we are at a similar moment. We have vast new technologies. I'll say a little about those technologies. They are affecting and afflicting us in ways that we did not plan for or account for. They are making information, good and bad, available at an increasingly rapid rate. And they are disrupting established norms. And the young people are asking, what is and is not? And what path shall I take? So I'll keep those in mind as we talk a little bit about faith and science, and then the sacramental life. This should take 10 minutes to solve these pressing problems, and then we'll get on with the questions. So one of the things that René Descartes did, and I think it's essential if you're going to grasp the relationship between faith and science today to capture this one notion, the thought about the natural world, the philosophical realms of natural philosophy, as we used to call science, were based in the notions of Aristotle. And if you went to Catholic school uniquely, you know all of these Aristotelian premises, or if you studied philosophy in a good academy, not necessarily in every university will you hear Aristotle taught. But the four causes, which some of you will know, the material, the formal, the efficient, and the final causes. And they're classic examples for these. A chair, the material is wood, right? The form is the shape of a chair. The efficient cause is carpentry, and the final cause is dining or something like that. What Descartes noticed about the arguments going on in his day is that all of the serious problems were around final causes. When we started to ask, what does it mean? What is it here for in the natural world? Why do we have it, and why is it that way? And he said, let's ban those from natural science. Let's keep only the first three. And he even says, by doing this, we will become the masters and the possessors of nature. And he even talks about technological advance in these starkly modern terms, to wrestle with nature until we understand its principles and we can apply them in the making of new things and the application of new technologies to the world. But he had another view of natural science, which I think we have departed from, and I want to go back to it for just a minute. What he said was there's two parts to it. He wanted to base it all on reason, but reason, logic, or dialectic, is just a way to get from a set of premises to some conclusions through a set of syllogistic arguments, where one thing leads to another using the laws of logic or mathematics, and you reach a new and interesting conclusion from something you already knew. But relevant to that first question, what is and what is not, he said, what is it we already know, and how do we know it? And this is where the most famous, if you know nothing else about Descartes, you'll know cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And what he's saying is, I know one thing, I know I am thinking. I can intuit that I don't need any other first principle. I'm in the act of thinking, and I'm thinking now about thinking, and I know that's happening somehow. And he tried to get from that simple premise into a place where he could have enough intuitive understanding to build a logical system of science. And he really failed in numerous ways. Now, he also thought intuitively one knew that there was a God, a creator, and he knew this in the same kinds of ways that we know it. That is not necessarily evident in natural science today. We'll talk about this more, but there's a trend in which scientists have forgotten the first principles are negotiable. They've had them long enough. In other words, in physics, there is a material world. We've measured its properties and understand its basic principles, but that's it. Matter and energy, two forms of the same thing, are everything. There is no other thing. Anything we would take to be mental activity or the mind or the spirit are the epiphenomena, the emanations of some neural networks in our brain that operate according to principles we're learning to deploy in artificial intelligence, and that's the whole story. But that's part of the assumptions that grew out of this getting rid of the final cause, the reason that things exist. And it's a real forgetting of what happened later after Descartes in science. I'll say more about it in a minute. But what I want to keep in mind here is that the way most scientists actually work, as opposed to how some people profess they work, is there are a set of intuitive principles that go unquestioned, that are not provable in any way. They're just a given part of the system, and they're built upon them. And inasmuch as the syllogisms bring us to conclusions that we call truths, the truths are highly dependent on a set of conjectures in the beginning that are not uncontestable. And so science is not complete in that way. I think one of the interesting things that happened in mathematics, there was a thought at the end of the 19th century that mathematics could be complete. You have a limited number of postulates, you have arithmetic, you can prove things in arithmetic, and it was Kurt Gödel in the early 20th century who demolished this project. He showed that mathematics is not complete. He proved that there are true statements in any arithmetic system that cannot be proved from the premises. And he wrote that proof out using set theory. And so not even mathematics is complete in this way. So this idea that somehow we have sure and certain things without using our intuition, our measurements, and our understanding of the natural world is simply not one that's tenable either in science or in math. The second thing I want to talk about is next to science, and it's technology. And of course, Descartes fascinated with technology, and he was correct. Let's think about how correct he was. The principles of nature are so well known that we can take essentially sand, silicon, dope it with some other materials, make something called a microchip, etch using optical science a pattern on it. The pattern becomes a circuit, a miniature circuit with logic and transistors. We can do that in a way that uses hardened materials so radiation doesn't create errors in it. We can package it in a little dip package, put it into a circuit board, put it inside of a satellite, put the satellite on a rocket, launch the rocket repeatedly and reliably into space, and orbit those electronics so that instantly when you take out your phone, it can show you where you are on the road and how to get to the next place, so that you've all forgotten how to read a map. And if you lose your phone, you can't get where you're going. But this is command of technology. I think we're there. Where are we working to get greater command of technology? Biology, right? Physics is in a way simple. As you break things down into smaller pieces, they don't get more complex. The atom is less complex than the molecule. The neutrino and the quarks, which don't exist except in confinement, are simpler still. And people thought biology would be that way, that the cell would be this undifferentiated mass of some kind of protoplasm, and that what the complexity was when you had collections of cells. Well, this is, as we know, completely wrong. The deeper you get in the cell, the more complex it appears to be. When simple principles cannot move materials in and out of or around inside of a cell, what I mean is physical principles. You've all put a piece of ink on the paper and watched it diffuse and spread, and the cell uses that to move things around. But sometimes it needs things to go opposite of physics, the other way. So there are literally proteins in the cell that have 2 feet, really 2 appendages, and they use ATP, the energy granting substance in the cell, to walk along highways in the cell, and on their heads they carry nutrients and other things around in the cell, not relying on diffusion or physical principles, but relying on a mechanical device inside the cell that looks like creatures walking on a highway, and they're tiny actual proteins that do this without violating the laws of physics. In other words, there are physical principles at work in miniature that power this motion, that direct it in some way, and move materials. And all of this happens according to some different laws of physics than diffusion, but it's not, you can see it's not simple. So I'm going to move on, but I just want to win an argument really quickly. It's not an argument that matters, but since we're talking about science and we got into cells, I want to talk about the eye for a minute, because the eye has been the subject of a debate about an argument called the argument from design for a long, long time. And everyone knows or has heard of the watchmaker argument, William Paley, right? Not a Catholic, who says, oh, if you stumble over a rock, you think in a meadow or a heath, oh, that rock could have been there for all time and there's nothing unusual. But if you kick up a watch, from its intricacy and complexity, you infer it must have been made for some purpose. So what is Paley doing? He's trying to reintroduce the purpose, the telos, into natural science. He's trying to undo Descartes and make an argument that from complexity in nature, you can infer the existence of a deity. We can talk about that argument, but one of the people who has attempted to refute the argument using the eye is Richard Dawkins, who wrote The Blind Watchmaker. Now, the arguments about the eye and its evidence for design go back to Cicero. You can read Cicero talking about the eye and how it means there must be deities, but he means the gods Jupiter and others. And so we can say that that argument, even if it's compelling, may not get you where you want to be. But what Dawkins says is, well, the eye is not a great example of design. It looks like, and he quotes another person here, like the work of a superannuated and maybe feeble deity who doesn't do good design. And he says the evidence for that is it does something no engineer would do. That the wires that carry the electrical impulses that your eye makes from light to the brain are on the front of the device. This is his argument. It's a bad design. And he says no engineer would do it. Now, it's hard for me to really grapple with his claims about God and the eye. But he's making a statement about engineers and the eye that one can test, right? So let's ask, what did engineers do when they needed to make a copy of the eye? You know them as CCD detectors. They're in digital cameras. In fact, it starts with a photocell. Look at the first photocell. The wires are on the front and the light has to go through them. Look at the first CCDs. The wires are on the front and the light has to go through them. This perturbs astronomers for the same reason it perturbs Dawkins. Those wires, which are circuitry, absorb part of the light. And we want all of the light. We paid money to make a big bucket of telescope to collect the light, and we don't want it to get absorbed in some wires. So the first detectors that were made by engineers that didn't have the wires on the front were made for astronomy. They took a regular detector and they sliced it off of its base, and it's about the thickness of tinfoil at that point, very fragile, flipped it over, rebonded all the wires, and made a detector where the light hit the silicon first, and it was 50% more efficient. And we used those, and they cost, instead of $9.95, or at that time CCDs were thousands of dollars, the first ones were hundreds of thousands of dollars to do. And the reason engineers didn't do it that way at first is the way you have to make it. Something about the process of construction and the durability of the device requires it, right? So Dawkins may not be wrong in all of his arguments, and the argument from design has its own problems, But he's wrong about what engineers did. But that's not all. I want to tell you something else, something we learned a few years ago that I hope will make you have a sensation that it makes me have. So these wires, they're actually called Mueller cells. It's a kind of nerve cell. And they sit on your retina above the photodetectors. And you have 3 different kinds. You see 3 colors. That's why 3 colors on a television set can imitate any color by changing their relative brightness. Your brain makes all the colors from the ratios of the 3. So these cells in your eye that convert light into electrical impulses, if you have a red detector, then any light that hits it is not going on a blue or a green detector. So a color camera has filters over the pixels, red, green, and blue. And this means you're losing, again, 2/3 of the light. So if you want to make a color device, which the eye is, with 3 colors, each spatial part is only good for 1 color. And that's the best our engineers have been able to do. The eye is better, far better, because these Mueller cells are adapted to have a clump at the top that collects light from everywhere. They're packed together, that funnels it into a quantum waveguide. Now, light is a wave in some ways, and you can make something the size that some light will be channeled or bounced down it like a fiber optic, and shorter wavelengths will not. So what happens in these Mueller cells is, far from absorbing light, they sort the light. They put the red and green down on the red and green detectors. They leak the blue light out to the adjacent blue detectors so that the eye has a better efficiency than any color camera an engineer can make. So whether or not one is compelled to believe in design from that, and I don't think we necessarily are, the argument that it's a bad design is wrong. So just, not everything you should not believe everything you read from a zoologist when they're doing philosophy. Let's talk about moving from science now to technology, because I want to encourage somebody to build me a device like the eye that sorts the light. Knowing the principles of the physical world from science and beginning to deploy them in these commanding ways, we have new innovations. And now let's start to move toward thinking about the sacramental life and about life in a technological world. These technologies have unintended cultural consequences, and they're ones that we don't manage well. And I'll just give you some example. Right now, birth rates in the United States are at an all-time low, about 1.8 children per family, per woman. And the world is converging on that number. It's a very interesting plot to look at those birth rates. It was about 3 here in the 60s. It went up to 7 in some countries. And they're all coming down to a single number. It looks like we're going to land at about 1.7 to 1.8. Well, there are technologies that enable that. There are technologies, some of them forbidden to Catholics, I will mention. But what is the change associated with that? It means 2 out of every 3 kids may have a sibling, but the 3rd will not. It means you will have maybe 4 cousins, 3 or 4 cousins, instead of the numbers people used to have. So the family is a very different kind of thing than it was even 40 or 50 years ago. And I think what I'm sensing in our youth at UNC, and it's compounded by the second thing I'll talk about, is loneliness. We are a lonelier people in some ways than we've ever been. Now, there are more of us than there have ever been, but our connections are fraying and more frail than they've ever been. And part of that is the second technology I will discuss, and that is the internet and the portable device in the hand. We have a Winston Center at UNC that's studying what happens when you give a young child a phone and it becomes an addiction. And they have some alarming numbers. They've put tools on phones to count the touches. If you leave a phone with a kid who's doing something else, taking a test in class, if the phone is allowed, and the number of touches is multiple touches per minute. They have to be tapping the phone to see what has come, to see who has texted, to see if Instagram has something new. They're engaged digitally in a way that for some becomes a compulsion, for many becomes a compulsion. And that's a digital interaction, not a human interaction. And it's a very different thing. And I don't know that they're connected. I don't want to say that they are connected. But at the same time, we're seeing an epidemic of depression. We have 30-something% higher suicide rates than we've had in the past. And I think it takes me back to Descartes' more important questions, not how shall we do science, not shall we think about final or ultimate ends or reasons for things, but what path in life shall I take, and what is and what is not. Now, I want to do a little bit of history about the sacrament, and then we'll talk about sacramental life, and then I'll take some questions. It's really confusing to read Catholic theology, especially if you studied chemistry, right? Because chemistry has substances, chemical substances. And this evolved as a way to describe when Dalton was breaking down compounds into their constituents and always got the same numbers. He said, well, these ratios are telling us that the indivisibles, the atomic elements, each correspond to a substance that make different properties when you put them in compounds. And it's almost impossible for us to unwind from substance as being a chemistry. But substances in Aristotle are the elements of the world. Philosophically, they are the things in the world, the units of reality. So chair is a substance. It has more, it's a composite of, he thinks, form and matter. But it's a substance, and man is a substance, right? So these philosophical conversations require that we relearn some Aristotelian language. But I think we also need to not get things out of order. And let's go to St. Thomas Aquinas and think about what he was doing. When St. Thomas Aquinas lived, everyone had believed in the Eucharist as being the body and blood of Christ in a real way for more than 1,000 years. And the word transubstantiation or transelementation had been used for a couple of hundred years at that time. But he was in the academy. And the academy was in love with the philosophy of Aristotle. And there began to be questions. Aristotle being the ultimate authority in philosophy, and they did think in terms of authority, and in philosophy and natural philosophy. Scripture, the teachings of the church and tradition being the ultimate theological authority, they began to intersect and sometimes contradict. And there was a danger that the academy would abandon its Christian principles and Christian faith. So he harmonized them. He didn't start with Aristotelian philosophy and prove anything about transubstantiation. He translated an idea and showed that it was consistent with the language and the philosophical principles of Aristotelian thought at that time. And so I think having that in the right order is important, because elaborations come later and may be different language, and none of it changes the basic theological fact, but the language we use for it and the language some Protestants use for it is different. If you go back to Luther and look at what he thought, he was much closer to a modern Catholic than a modern Lutheran. He believed in a presence in the Eucharist that was very real and not symbolic. He just didn't like the Aristotelian framing that had been put around it. I'm oversimplifying a little. So I just wanted to say that because it's that back to that intuition and what one can show from it. There is not a set of first philosophical principles from which one derives our theology. Our theology comes from a revealed and intuitive set of principles. So the design we see in the eye and in the universe begins to give us this sense that it can't be accidental. And even the Darwinists here, and I am one, I believe in evolution as a process whereby things change over time. but they're changing in a way that's following a set of natural principles that have embedded some order that is so profound that you get innovation over generations that's better than the innovation we can do now in some cases. And that mysterious feeling that this thing is too good, that Darwin can't be right, I always rephrase as, it's so good Darwin can't be the whole story. There is more to that story. It's a richer and more elaborate story than we can do in our Darwinian evolutionary theory. But that's true of all science. And science legitimately should make no claim, and has not really, to be complete. We don't have a complete theory of the origin of man. We don't have a complete theory even of quantum mechanics. There are problems there. So I think one needs to put these things in their proper place and realize there's some set of first principles that we're not deriving from Aristotle. We may be explicating with Aristotle in our theology. But let's get to what we can say about that. So what a modern scientist would say is everything not in the domain of science, some scientists would say, or physical measurement, is a superstition, right? That our belief in the Eucharist is a superstitious belief because it's beyond the tests of natural science. But in fact, that position is contradictory in some ways because so are the principles of science, as I've already discussed. And so things like the law of non-contradiction in logic, scientists accept that. They accept it intuitively, not because it's been proved. The persistence of bodies in time. Well, we see them over time, or do we? The only experience we have is now, if you think about it. This kind of freaks physicists out. Now is the only thing where measurement can happen. I can't measure what happened before. I hope it's recorded somewhere and not dissolving or mutating, right? I've assumed that really, that when I come back to my logbook with yesterday's measurements, the numbers there are the ones I wrote and that my memory is holding them correctly. And of course we can't measure the future. We can try to predict what's going to happen in the future. So the slice in which we live compared to all of reality is this very narrow now, and it's passing us by. And maybe what I said a minute ago was received and stored by all of you the same way. Maybe it's already mutating. So if you don't use your common sense and intuition, you really can't make progress on anything. So something everyone does, we should not accuse others of selectively using. And so I think it's important to remember these different ways of knowing, the logical work that comes based on the premises and the premises themselves, which no amount of arguing with logic is ever going to establish or prove. So I'll make a corollary to this statement about the framework, the intuitive plus deductive framework. A sacramental life based on mental or spiritual intuition, revealed truth, in our case, and spiritual desire to be united in charity is not within the purview of physical science to measure. And if we maintain continuity in our liturgical practice, it's not or should not be subject to the disruptions of technology. So I'm weaving in now both of the things we were talking about, the view of science that is a combination of intuition and then reason, and technology which grows out of science without considering the ends for which it is being used or the effects it might be having unintentionally when it goes outside the bounds of those ends. And you know, it's really in suggesting a liturgical conservatism, right? Now you may understand why, when human voice was all that we had heard in worship, musical instruments as technological advancements were regarded with some suspicion. Why today there are Christian churches that ban the use of instrumental music because it's not scriptural. It's an innovation in the liturgy. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't have an organ in the church. I'm just saying, what is the one thing in your life the one time when your cell phone is off. For many people, that is becoming the liturgy. I hope mealtime is another opportunity to put them away. But when we begin to let those technologies unintentionally move into our sacramental life, we have to be on guard in the same way as when we let the weak arguments of materialist scientists begin to challenge our faith in ways that are inappropriate. I think they go together. I think the technological part is as important to consider when we think about faith and science as the philosophical and the practical parts that practicing scientists do. Live streams, which we're doing now. A great way for people to be able to participate in a lesser way in a liturgical moment or sacrifice. But as Catholics, we don't believe that it's a full substitute for the liturgy that we practice together in our sacramental life. So I think this liturgical element of sacramental life obviously is sacred, but it's sacred in two ways, right? We know it's holy and sacred and a representation of Christ's sacrifice, but I think it should be sacred in another way. There's simply things we should try to keep out of bounds. And I think in our own practices, in our own prayer practices and participation in that sacramental life, we need to be circumspect about what we allow in, because we can see outside of the liturgical sphere in the other parts of our life, in our intellectual life, in our social life. We can see the unintended effects of not being on guard against things that happen when you let technology push too far. So let me go back to the questions, right? The questions that Descartes had asked. What is and is not? Well, for us, the center of our lives, what is the very presence of our Lord in the Eucharistic elements. Can I measure something there with science? If I weigh the Eucharist, do I expect some physical change? No. We're talking about a different plane, one not accessible to the physical chemists by any method. And so it's not within the bounds of natural science to do much with. That doesn't mean we can't use current philosophy and natural science, as Aquinas did, to try to surround it and harmonize it with some language. The second question, and this will be my last point, is what path shall I take in life? And so what I say to young people and even people my age, because I'm still in a way deciding what I want to do. It's not be provost forever, I promise. Look at those who flourish. We ask the question, who is flourishing in the world? What is the common element? Natural science does not have as its end the promotion of human flourishing. It does not think about ends other than more knowledge. When natural science alone and by itself is turned to the promotion of human flourishing, it has very mixed success, because a science of material and technological knowledge development and the mysteries of the human soul and their nourishment in the sacramental life are beyond its purview. And that boundary exists in things like our School of Public Health. The #1 public school of public health is at UNC. But I sometimes watch as scientific application of principles to human flourishing run in directions that don't consider what I think are the most important elements of that human flourishing. So we need to think hard about what the church can do, what we, the church, can do about our sacramental life together and how we organize it and how we preserve it in the face of rapid change. And we need not to criticize science on unfounded grounds, but we need to remember that science, by its own declaration, is a limited tool. It does not necessarily promote human flourishing, especially through some of its technological advances. And we cannot look to it to do better without information and intuitions that we will bring to it. And that is, I think, the role of a natural scientist or a health professional in the academy, which is to bring that Catholic intuition about human flourishing into the academy. So the last thing about I'll say is there's this great quote from Nacho Libre, one of the finer movies. His friend Esqueleto, he says, "I only believe in science," right? And that illustrates a couple of truths. Science is a belief system. It includes things that are not provable from its own principles. And if you watch the rest of the movie, Nacho says, "Well, this is why I keep losing, because you only believe in science." And he said, "Well, we're losing because you're fat." And that was his answer. The science, the sacramental life, and the flourishing of the human soul are part of an intuitive system of belief and a revealed system of belief that are not in conflict with science. We should not think we have to apologize to scientists for our superstitions. They are no different than the superstitions that scientists have in some ways. They are the ground material on which we build not just a reasonable set of life principles, but on which we build, I hope, the condition for human flourishing. So the path you should take is that which copies the human flourishing of others. And it's always knowing, loving, and serving God and neighbor, rooted in participation in the sacramental life. So thank you for listening, and I will now move to having a conversation. All right, let's take questions. I'll let you manage that.
Sure. So we're open floor now.
Barbara had a question. In case this is the stupidest question. You were kind of bumping science against the sacramental framework, and apparently 70% of us here don't believe in real presence. You know, I'm not going to say I do, but hopefully all of us do. That's why we're here. But we're always looking for answers. We're looking for support for apologetics. And I was just wondering, when you bump science against that sacramental framework, is it at all possible that quantum entanglement somehow explains our connection of the Eucharistic elements to Christ?
Yeah, so if you didn't hear the question, Bruce is asking.
It's Barbara's question.
It's Bruce and Barbara's question is, as we think about just what I was saying, as Aquinas had taken the best or authoritative philosophy of his day and asked, can I harmonize it with our belief in the presence? What do we do with quantum mechanics? Right now, there's a danger in that question, which is because quantum and quantum entanglement are at the very forefront of science. What we're making a claim is that eventually, along those principles of physical science, physics, in some future date, we may make a discovery which not only harmonizes, but explains, right? Now, that's not quite a heresy, but Council of Trent, without backing away from the Aristotelian framework, said it was not explained. It is a mystery. And it remains a mystery in the face of all the current science that we have. So I don't have any aspiration that it will cease being a mystery. But you give me a chance to say something about quantum mechanics, which I will take, because I think it illustrates something even better about physicists. When we calculate what happens to a system of particles, we use an equation, Schrödinger or Dirac equation. They're wave equations. They treat the goings on in the quantum world as the particles, if you like, electrons, photons, light, as waves, and even ensembles of particles are a set of waves. And it works tremendously well in a certain way. You establish a measurable, and that tells you the state of a system, and then you put that system through some experiments, and then you calculate with the wave equations how the material or particles should evolve. And when you get to the other side, you do another measurement, and you find something interesting. The measurement of an ensemble of many particles matches exactly But if you only measure one, there's a random component to what happens. And so there's a classic experiment. If you have one slit and you put light through it, it'll make a diffuse pattern on the wall. If you put two slits, you'll get an interference pattern, dark, bright, dark, bright. The waves are interfering. But the way you measure at the other end is you see individual particles hitting, and they hit in some places and don't in others. So probabilistically, they're more likely to be where the wave was large, and where it's small, they're not likely to be there. So you're thinking, well, that means the particles we're measuring went part through one slit and part through another. Let's see how much. So if you try to measure at the slit, the pattern goes away. So this wave function is, and even Heisenberg pointed this out, it's like the potency, the prime matter potentia of Aristotle. It is a calculating device, but you can't measure it. The measurements all introduce this random component, and only after many measurements do you see that something was meaningful was done. So quantum mechanics is a two-layer philosophy, and it has a mysterious component that can't be measured. All of the calculations we do with the Dirac or Schrödinger equation do not result in individual measurements that we can test for certain, only in ensembles. So it's a very funny theory. It has a world of potency with waves, but what are the waves? They're waves of likelihood, of possibility, and then they get converted upon measurement into something that we can actually see. So by analogy, right? I'm not saying there's a quantum connection. By analogy, the Eucharist requires at least a two-part theology or philosophy. A material world and a substratum of the material world, a world, if you like, of ideal forms, or we can use different philosophical statements. And that is the world in which this miraculous change is occurring. That's not so different. I don't feel like the physicists are much less spooky in their philosophy than we are in our theology. So I think, but looking for an absolute connection where we map that unmeasurable set of wave function physics onto some unmeasurable by physical means change, I think we're in a layer that's not going to intersect. And if it did, because we can't measure, how would we know? We can only measure outcomes. That was a complicated answer, but maybe you know more about quantum mechanics now. Yes.
The Eucharistic miracle.
Do scientists believe in the Eucharistic miracles? So there are a number of Eucharistic miracles, and I don't know how all scientists would feel about them. I know Catholic scientists who believe in some established miracles. I believe in some established miracles. I do not believe in every miracle that is claimed, right? So miracles are a very interesting space here because they do touch on a physical measurement of a miraculous event. And so there we are actually making a claim that an empiricist physicist would see the same thing as a faithful Catholic, a change in the world that cannot be explained in their system. Their reaction to it is often very different. So I'll give you an example. Lourdes. Many people have claimed to be cured at Lourdes, but the Catholic Church uses a kind of empirical set of tests to ask, is this a real miracle? And not very many have passed that empirical test. Now, that empirical test is not quite like empirical science, but it has many of the same elements. Is there possibly a natural explanation? Were they under an advanced treatment that could explain it, and therefore no miraculous event was necessary? Well, the French novelist Émile Zola, who was a skeptic, went to Lourdes, and he made the cynical comment, "I see many crutches, but no wooden legs." And his point was, these are psychosomatic cures, right? People get off their crutches and maybe they think they're better. But if someone regrew a leg and had the leg hanging there, the wooden one, because they had a real one, then I'd be impressed. He wanted more, right? But in his cynicism, He saw one of the proved miracles. He was lucky enough to be present for that, but never believed it. And he wrote a novel in which he denigrates Catholics really for that belief. So you can read what scientists who are materialists say. If we see something like that, we hope to explain it according to our principles eventually. And Dawkins even says if you see the hand of a statue of the Virgin Mary wave at you, you should just say it's quantum mechanics. It's really, really unlikely, but it's not impossible because he's doing the thing. Quantum mechanics says that could be explained. And so if you could explain it in the natural physical world, the physicists would come and say, therefore, there is no God needed for transubstantiation. It's part of the natural physical process. So I encourage you to go. I talked a lot about miracles at the Newman Center. You can go hear a whole hour on what I think about miracles in the Whittington lecture from last February. But I do believe in them.
So I find in a debate about the place of science relative to religion, it's a near guarantee that Galileo will come up since he's sort of the poster boy for the collision or the apparent collision between faith and science. Do you have an answer you tend to use that's sort of a charitable way that does justice both to Galileo and the church officials at the time?
That is charitable to whom? Galileo?
To everyone involved.
Okay.
And to the person you're talking to.
Yes. We should do an hour on Galileo sometime. I highly recommend the book by James Heilbronn, who just passed away, called Galileo. He wrote, I think, the best treatment of this. And he was a student of Thomas Kuhn, so he has great training and credentials in physics as well as history and philosophy. Difficult book to get through, but he essentially believes that Galileo will eventually be beatified or even made a saint. Galileo was a humanist first. He was a deep empiricist. His father, a musician, got into the argument about whether the scale of musical notes is the one mathematics teaches. Is it Platonic? Or is it the one, if you take pipes and cut them until it sounds right, you derive experimentally? And he fell very much in the experimental camp. And Galileo grew up in that workshop. And he built his own workshop to do mechanical tests with balls rolling on inclined planes. And what he's doing there is trying to slow down falling motion. It's the same principle to fall on a plane slowly as it is to fall quickly without that plane. And he showed that by taking a plane and lifting it higher and higher and higher until it was all the way vertical. And that's free fall. But the same principles maintain, but they're easier to measure. And he would take little bells, probably borrowed from the music workshop, and he would space them out in different ways till he heard a uniform cadence as the ball hit them, and look at the distances to see how much faster the ball was going. So he had all of these really tremendous experimentalists. What he claimed in his dialogues was a mechanical proof for the motion of the earth. Now, he had already intuited that the Copernican system with the sun at the center was better. It was an intuition. But what people were looking for at that time was a proof. And he makes this claim in a dramatic book, which is a dialogue, because he's writing for humanists, and it's compelling to humanists. But it was absolutely and utterly balderdash with respect to physics. And I teach a course on this. If he had talked to one sailor about tides, he would have understood the period of the tides, and his theory is wrong compared to what sailors knew to be true. So he's not convincing. Not to scientists of the day. He's convincing to the public of the day. So all the Pope had asked him to do was put what he called the medicine at the end. Don't claim to have a proof. Show your best argument and say that it's still a matter of conjecture and debate. And he did put that argument in. He put it in the mouth of Simplicio, the idiot, or the Aristotelian nitwit, and made fun of it. And so he was provoking, right? And he got what he wanted, which was a reaction to be taken before the Inquisition. And he got a mild punishment, house arrest. It has been rewritten entirely because what happened after that is interesting. The Jesuits made a copy of his telescope, Christopher Clavius, Collegio Romanum. They verified his observations, which don't prove, but do suggest with moons going around Jupiter that the Earth could go around the sun. But there's this other model there, Tycho Brahe's model, where the Earth is still at the center. And comets turn out to be the real interesting part. Aristotle thought comets were emanations of the atmosphere, because these models of the universe were solid crystalline spheres. Nothing can move through them. In fact, there can't be gaps, and that's why everything had to be circular. And they put wheels inside of other wheels. But you nest this, it's a solid thing with balls moving around in it, and that's how they thought about it, because the heavens were crystalline substance. Tycho Brahe said, no, they're fluid. And then he proved it by measuring how far a comet was, and he showed it was beyond the moon, and therefore moving through these spheres easily. And Galileo denied that. And Grassi wrote an utter takedown and just floored Galileo, but he would never admit that he was wrong about that particular part, because he wanted all of Copernicanism, not just the sun at the center, but the crystalline spheres as well. So 100 years, Jesuits dominated astronomy and attempted to measure whose theory was actually right, because these theories are very close together in the appearances. The key difference turns out to be the diameter of the sun, and it's a tiny difference. And this was, they attempted to measure on the floors of the cathedrals of Europe. They turned the cathedral in Bologna, in San Petrono, into a vast solar observatory. They put a meridian line on the floor. They did measurements all year long for years. They learned about the settling of the church, and then they learned how to measure things precisely. They did this in 3 or 4 more cathedrals of Europe. And a Jesuit student named Cassini in Paris finally made the ultimate measure that showed Kepler's theory with elliptical orbits around the sun matches the measurements of the solar diameter done on the floor of these vast spaces. And so when did the Jesuits finally say the Earth goes around the sun? It was after Cassini, because their work was complete. But they took on an enormous project. And I should point out, Descartes was Jesuit trained in a Jesuit university. The Jesuits started the university system in the mid-1500s, and by 1600 had a vast network of universities all the way to China. So anyone who thinks universities can't be reformed or they're doomed, Jesuits made a whole system in 50 years that spanned the then known world. So great things can happen. That's a long answer. Galileo was right in the end. The Copernican model was better, but the Copernican model is wrong in as much as the heavens are not a solid sphere. We move rockets through them, and not even a fluid. So it's more complex, right? It's nuanced, but it makes a nice story to hear that the church was backward and they persecuted the hero of science, Galileo. But he was a guy who was right and wrong and obnoxious in all the ways that scientists can be. The sequel to Galileo is called The Sun and the Church, also by Heilbronn. I highly recommend the book. It tells about the history of the cathedrals of Europe as solar observatories.
You stated that there is no music in the Bible. That I do object to, because in the book of Psalms, God gave David the gift of music, and he told him, he gave him 2 gifts of it. One, to worship him through all of the music, and two was for memory. Because this day and age, as well as before, we may not have had the notes of the music paper, sheet music that is, but we do have the sound of it. And when we sing it in orderly fashion and trying to memorize something like the New Testament, because I even know that all the way through, every single book in chronological order through music.
Yeah, thank you. Let me try to state what I meant to say if I said it wrong. There is a branch of the Church of Christ that does not allow instrumental music because they regard it as an innovation not in the Bible. That's not my position. It's not a Catholic position. I was using it as evidence that the resistance to technology and liturgy is a widespread thing. And I was saying I don't think it's necessarily bad, that I think being slow about how you make those changes, especially if you go to some churches, they project words on a screen and they have more technology than we use in the Catholic Church. I'm not criticizing it. I'm just saying it's the one space where the pace of technological change needs to be a reserved pace, because I feel sometimes like it's the last haven that we have to sing together with our voices and not have electronic assistance or auto-tuning or whatever. You could auto-tune your choir and sound better, but I'm not suggesting we do. So thank you, though. I think I wasn't meaning to suggest there was no music in the Bible. I was trying to express something that another church has a choice they've made in their worship.
So you spoke about the success of Thomism as a syncretism between Aristotelianism and Christianity and the Christian faith. Can you speak to the possibility of such a syncretic approach to modern science, or do you think that like a modernist approach, or do you think between the loss of final cause, institutionalization, that the capacity to have the discussion that needs to be had can't be done in that terminology?
Yeah, I'm very optimistic about it. Let me try to characterize where I think we are, not me personally, but where we as a culture are. The philosophers are behind in a certain way. The way we teach philosophy is to go through the historical philosophers. And when I read people like Descartes and Kant, and they all had a much closer alignment between cosmology, galaxies, astronomy, and philosophy, and even theology. There was a unity there. But a lot of their theories are antiquated in the realm of cosmology. Their cosmologies are simply wrong. They're disprovable. Does that mean their philosophical framework is wrong? No, but it does shake it, I think. And so the way I would characterize the philosophical position of the entire university today is Kantian. We are embedded in a very Kantian worldview, and we can talk about what that is. And that's a very hard one, unlike Aristotelianism, to syncretize with religion. It's in fact almost excluded from the beginning from that framework. But it's not working. And it's wrong in ways that are more and more obvious from natural scientific investigation. So we're waiting on a doctor of the church who is able to digest what will be a much vaster set of information. Because Aquinas could, in his lifetime, read almost every available manuscript. There just weren't as many works. To come and show us where we need to go philosophically to do that. The good news is I do not see any looming contradiction on the horizon. I think, in fact, it's the other way. Every time the positivists and others, the pure materialists, began to claim victory over superstition and religious faith, they melted down in various ways, which by itself is a kind of argument that that's not a path that's going to succeed, not in any way that we can foresee. Whereas the path of understanding, I think by re-importing some essentially physicists without knowing it are Aristotelian realists, even though they pretend for reasons of argument to be positivists and materialists and when they don't like religion. And look, physicists are about half and half. It's not that everyone in the sciences is an atheist and no one is co-religionist. but they're in narrow disciplinary channels. So my physics colleagues, they don't have time to read Kant. They're trying to read the literature and get to the next discovery. So it's a different way of putting knowledge together than the German academy. What we have in the academy is a German research university wedded to a kind of medieval structure to make big research possible and to get $1.5 billion from the NIH and other agencies. But you do that by being a deep disciplinary expert, which makes you narrow. And so thinkers like Thomas Aquinas are people who think that well are probably here. People who think that broadly are very rare in the academy. And I think theologians will be required. But theologians don't learn physics. And I think you should, right? We should be teaching this even in the theological schools. I'm hopeful, but I can't. If I could tell you how to do it, I would publish a vast work explaining all that.
Dr. Clemens, thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Jeremy Roca. I don't need a mic. Would you just want to say thank you? My question is, would you speak more on the way of beauty? And you've noted that the only moment we have is now. And speak also, please, about James Webb Telescope and the beauty of that. And then when we step into the Eucharist, how it's Kairos time. What do you think? Yeah, what does that mean for a physicist and a Christian?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. No, I think it's interesting if you think about astrophysics and you listen to any astrophysicist, whether they have a religious faith or impulse or not, they all speak in the same reverent terms about the beauty of creation and about the order that they find there. And so I think, these fantastic technologies that are opening that up and raising even newer and better possibilities there are inspiring to everyone. For us as Christians, I think it's a chance to point those feelings of awe, reverence, and recognition of beauty to the same intuitions that we feel. Why do we think a benevolent and loving creator made all of this? The beauty by itself suggests that we can perceive the beauty, that the order makes sense. We seem to be possessing something that God himself has, to be made in that image and likeness, just to be able to understand it. And I think reflecting on that in visible ways and in ways where we say it out loud is probably more compelling than arguing about the construction of the eye for many people. Because that becomes, very quickly technical, and everyone can appreciate the beauty of the images we see coming back. I'll also point out that the Webb telescope is named after James Webb, UNC class of 1920 education school, and native of Oxford, North Carolina, where there's a school named after his father. So there's a North Carolina connection.
I'm Flavio Rojas, and I was thinking on the north of Chile, as I mentioned, the stars, and it struck me at night. Well, it's not casual that the greatest observatories are right there next to San Pedro de Atacama, and at night, gazing the stars, I feel struck by the magnificence, and how was possible that from this Big Bang chaotic, explosion, the entire universe evolved in a way to make this world we live possible. And what I'm struck is about this millimetric interaction of many variables, many factors, to the millionth or billionth, in a way that if we had put it in a different way or make it the Earth closer to the Earth, to the sun, in millions, there would not be life possible here. And the same thing, if we were a little, just millions, away from the sun, there would not be life. So, I mean, I get really struck by this great, well, they call it the great design. Someone made it. And every time it inspires me, the nature, how nature is one side organized in such a way. You said the order of things, you mentioned that. And also the man, people, the human beings that came out of this spectacular, perfect. To me, well, God is perfect. This is the crucial way to say to physics, there's nothing in your system that you could lead, that it could lead to perfection, and no matter what, no matter how many experiments, so this is something that strange in a way. But I would like your perspective.
Thank you. Before I talk about what you're talking about are the so-called cosmic coincidences, and I will say something about it. But let me also say a little bit about being on a mountain in Chile. As it happens, the stars we see in the northern hemisphere are not the same as the southern hemisphere because the Earth's axis always points in the same direction in space as we go around the sun. And the most beautiful part of the sky really is the center of our Milky Way galaxy. And here it's always low in the sky. But if you go down to the Atacama Desert, not only will you be gasping for air because you're above much of the atmosphere, and that means you see better as long as you don't deprive your eyes of oxygen too much, you will see a much grander spectacle in the sky. And I was happy to take 4 of our children there when they were younger, and my wife, and we drove up to the mountains because I was there doing some work on a telescope. And we all closed our eyes and turned off all the lights because 20 minutes is required to get your eyes ready. And then without making any light come on, we stepped out into the night. And the spectacle is awe-inspiring in ways that our own sky here could never be because you're looking at a nebular cloud and dark patches of dust and the number of stars, this uncountable, vast number of stars that you see looking toward the bulge of our galaxy. So that's a great experience. Glad you could have it. I used to work in a telescope dome, and it's interesting. The acoustics of telescope domes are great for singing. And I would be up all night and trying to keep awake, and I would sing hymns in the dome because I felt that it was very much like a cathedral of science, but I was singing Catholic hymns, not science hymns. The cosmic coincidences are part of what I think Stanley Jakey has called the cosmological argument. It's different from an argument from design. It isn't saying that God is literally putting us together like a Lego set each time by hand. It's saying that we can have things like quantum optics in our eye to increase the efficiency, and that nature can discover them over time without violating any physical laws is by itself evidence that some very subtle mind is at work in the construction of this. And then when you look at the physics that guides everything, the number of principles is so small, there doesn't seem to be the freedom to make something so good. And then you ask, what if we changed one of the constants that doesn't emerge from our theory, but we measure, like the fine structure constant that governs, it's a dimensionless constant for electromagnetism. You change it by a tiny amount, all the atoms are different, they don't exist in some way. The expansion of the universe is accelerating. That happened once rapidly, it's happening again. There's a special time in which we live without being ripped apart by that, whatever is causing it. This number of things piles up until even cosmologists say, very hard to explain, it looks fine-tuned just to allow us to be here. Now, to your earlier point, though, what do they say is the answer to avoid having to go down the Catholic path? Because, Galileo and all, we're not going to go down that path. They have a different thing. They say, Well, if it weren't that way, we couldn't be here asking the question. So it has to be that way in any place where there are people to ask. But that implies there's some failed versions that don't have people in them. And so what they do is they multiply universes to infinity to get our one good one. And that's considered to be better than admitting to a benevolent creator who lovingly made it for us to be in it. We're doing philosophy, not physics. We're not doing astronomy then. And people, scientists cross over into it without realizing that they've left the domain. So when I ever see talks and they talk about the coincidences and fine tunings, I always ask them a question that begins with something like, in the religious notion that you introduced into your physics talk, that there must be multiple universes, do you have a test of that that we could actually do observationally? And the answer is usually no. These are very hypothetical kinds of solutions to this fine-tuning problem. But it is absolutely the case that we are on a knife edge. We are a construct on a knife's edge. If anything were different, it's not that we wouldn't be here. It's that really nothing. There would not be atoms. There would not be a universe. Nothing at all would be here. So take that for what you want. But it speaks to me intuitively that a mind is at work and is the reason I have a mind that can grasp it.
Okay, we'll take one more question.
Hi, okay, so I'm going to bring this down just a notch from the academics. So it feels like we live in this greater and greater polarization of sides, opinions, things, which you can argue is true or not. But my question is, if you're being in a position of someone who straddles both science and theology, science and faith, what tools have you formed to be able to have successful and curious conversations that bring in those opposite sides? How do you talk to your atheist colleagues in a way that everybody doesn't just feel defensive and dismissive? Or how do you speak about science to your religious group in a way that you feel like can come across effectively? How can we take all of this to expand open and curious conversations and allow more space for all of it to exist with less polarity?
Yeah, I showed you an example of how not to do that, actually. Earlier on, I indulged in I hope, lighthearted exercise, which was to win an argument that didn't actually matter. That's not how you convince people, as it turns out. Had Richard Dawkins been here, he would have had something to say, and he'd probably be offended. You have to be very circumspect about what you're hoping to accomplish. And I think part of our polarization comes from a kind of conviction on the part of people that it's their version of truth or politics or religion is the one, that we are not going to yield an inch to anyone, and we will either figuratively or literally attack when someone encroaches on the truths that we hold sacred. Whether or not our polarization is unusual, I think it's not been demonstrated that things are worse than ever. They certainly feel worse than they were due to the instant nature and the very short form of argumentation that happens in a 240 character tweet. We don't elaborate. We don't have time or space to sit and think and elaborate. I thought that's what the university was for. And we try, but we are missing some things. And what's happened over time, again, increasing specialization so that we don't have any expertise outside our own field, not thinking broadly. A failure to agree on what should be the common set of texts or portable knowledge that all students get so that they have a common basis to have a conversation and are not coming each with a different set of knowledge before you get to the ideas that one constructs from logical advancement. And so I think the university is, we should charge it, and I have, to do some new things and to do some things that we're not doing. And so I was happy a few years ago to found a program for public discourse to model how one can have these conversations. I think it is effectively doing that in some ways, better than some other places. And we will have a new School of Civic Life and Leadership, which will guide students who engage with it to do exactly what you say, to go back to the principles on which this nation was founded, look at some texts that we hopefully hold in common, and to be able to debate those in a constructive way that's not aimed at getting everyone to agree. The art of politics is not bludgeoning people until they agree with you. It's getting people who don't agree to work together on the same outcome despite the disagreement. And I think that's the thing we're not teaching. And so my hope is, not teaching well enough. I don't want to dismiss. There are colleagues who do this very well. There are departments where we do this, but not every student gets that experience. And so I think we have to broaden the experience, and we have to deepen our expertise and be intentional about the skills we give students to participate in a democracy. And it's about skill building, not just knowledge building. So that's the answer, I think. Simple, inexpensive, reform the university to do those things.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clemens.
In my life, I have very bad experiences. And those bad experiences bring me to the best divine experiences in my life. That's how I knew God. And it's how I know God until today. And my question is, why is the reason humanity needs technology? Because so far I know there's big technology companies racing all the time to bring us the best devices. And most of those devices, we really don't need them.
Yeah.
Like why people need Alexa. Why people need artificial intelligence. That's my question.
Well, thank you for the question. I am a fan of some technologies, and I think we've done a good job with some technologies. The example I always use is electricity. Electricity lifted more people out of poverty in the world than any other innovation because it delivers the ability to do work to your doorstep and saves the labor that you would expend in growing food, in cooking food, in lighting your spaces. And we did something interesting. Even though we had a constitution that said the federal government has these powers, and among them was not build an electric grid to serve people, we decided that we would not leave anyone out. That is, the rural electrification of America that happened in the 1930s delivered the wire to every doorstep, whether it made economic sense or not. It was a public-private socialist enterprise. And so we often will dismiss socialism as not working, and in general, as a system of government, it has been challenging to get it to work. But that version of private corporations regulated through a national program, anyone who lived through it and went from having to pump water out of a well by hand, carry it to a wood stove, and was spending all of their time just to sustain themselves, who could immediately turn a switch and keep food cold and have all the conveniences we enjoy. So I'm not knocking technology per se, but it wasn't very long before someone said, "This is a great way to, this is a great way to execute someone," right? And we had the electric chair as another way to do capital punishment. So it's not the technology itself, and the same with the phone. It's the obsession or the compulsion that it engenders, and our need as a society to get our arms around practices and habits that don't let us go down those rabbit holes, and that's hard. Because it's right now unbridled, and it will require discipline. No, it's true, but we keep buying them. Yeah. So I'm inviting you all to go home and get a hammer and smash your phone. Yeah. Yeah. We could at least get a box and lock it in there for a day a week or something. Turn off the internet.
All right. Well, thank you again, Dr. Christopher Clemens.